Hey guys, how's it going? So I have breaking news, and this is actually really good news. The United States Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has overturned President Trump's bump stock ban. And this is super, super important. This is not only going to be, in my opinion, precedent setting for the Fifth Circuit, but now creates some contention between the different circuits, and this could make this case go all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. So this is a huge victory for the whole United States, and especially a victory if you live in the Fifth Circuit. Now, I'm not giving any legal advice here, and one of the first things you guys are going to ask before I get into this is, are bump stocks now legal? I don't know, but I will say this. Circuit court precedent is binding for that particular circuit. So the Fifth Circuit would be composed of Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. It is not going to be binding case law or precedent setting law in the other circuits. However, United States Supreme Court decisions are, and that could be where this is heading, hopefully, very soon. So this comes from the Cargill v. Garland. A guy named Michael Cargill, living in Texas, challenged this bump stock ban as being unconstitutional, and I agree with him. I've been reporting on this since the very, very beginning. So it started off from the United States District Court for the Western District of Texas, who had decided against Cargill, who then appealed it to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. They had a smaller panel rule against him also, and then it got heard what's called en banc, and that's what this hearing is about today, this final decision from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. 16-judge panel. That's the full panel that was there to vote on this particular case. That means it can't be appealed any further whatsoever in the Fifth Circuit unless it goes to, of course, the United States Supreme Court, who reigns supreme over 13 different circuit courts. I wanted to give you guys some of the nuts and bolts of that. So I'm going to give you a real quick excerpt from a news article, then I'm going to actually read a couple spots from this decision. And I'm also going to be live streaming tonight. Depending when you see this, either you can come back and watch the live stream afterwards or during when you're watching this video. And I'm going to go into more of a deep dive because there's some really, really awesome things that were put into this ruling that makes sense to people like you and me and needs to be put out there and become precedent setting and not let the ATF keep on just doing whatever the heck they want, as I've been reporting quite a bit lately. It says in a 13-3 decision, the Fifth Circuit U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans, they're located in New Orleans, but they cover those three states, said that despite, quote, tremendous public pressure to impose a ban, it was up to U.S. Congress, rather than the president, to take action. Look, this is a 62-page decision, but in essence, some of the key takeaways from this, they said this so-called Chevron deference, which we've talked about a ton before. I'll talk about it more on my stream tonight. It wasn't going to apply to this. It couldn't be used, so that's awesome in and of itself. They also talked about the wordsmithing and changings of definitions after the fact, and the judges rejected that and said, no, that's not going to fly either. If the National Firearms Act says a single function of the trigger, and that is what it says, how can it later just be implied that, well, it must really mean a single pull of the trigger, and that a function has to do with how the trigger finger operates, even though, as in my opinion, rightfully noted, the court said no. It didn't say a single pull of the trigger. It says a single function of the trigger, and by the statutory definition and the plain reading of the statute itself, that it's not a machine gun. The bump stock is not a machine gun. They also talked about something else very important in here. Two more things. They said, look, you have to actually have a law that says what it says and means what it says, and that regular people have to actually be able to understand it. You can't put plain language in a law, which is very, very plain, in the National Firearms Act, and then later on, after people in good faith follow that law, just say, well, now this simple word means something totally separate. Something totally different than what the average person would understand with a plain reading. And I thought that was excellent. Very, very good that the justices here in this court were able to sit there, judges I should say, were able to sit there and realize that. I'm going to read from the very, very end of it. This is also a very important thing. They talked about that their scope was to look at what the law actually says. In contrast to what Trump, this is on Trump, guys, what Trump told the ATF to change it into. They say, no, only Congress makes law. And that you can't just sit there due to like emotional things, just change things when it's actually Congress's job to write laws. I'm going to read the end of this real quick, and then I'm going to, like I said, get into a deeper dive on my live stream. And I stream here every Friday night if you're new to the channel here on YouTube, and also check out my locals community. More information on that in the pinned comment. It says, many commenters argue that non-mechanical bump stocks contribute to firearms death. And if you remember, this was all an emotional thing due to that event that happened in Vegas where he was supposedly using bump stocks. Tragic event, right? But they're talking about that here. And that the final rule is good public policy. We express no opinion on those arguments because it is not our job to determine our nation's public policy. Amen. That solemn responsibility lies with the Congress. And our task is confined to deciding cases and controversies, which requires us to apply the law as Congress has written it. In defining the term machine gun, Congress referred to the mechanism by which the gun's trigger causes bullets to be fired. Policy judgment aside, we are bound to apply that mechanical definition. And applying that definition to a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a non-mechanical bump stock, we conclude that such a weapon is not a machine gun for purposes of the Gun Control Act and National Firearms Act. Chevron deference likely has no role here either, because the government waived it, or because it does not apply to the government's interpretation of a statute imposing criminal penalties. That's huge right there. Finally, even if the statute were ambiguous, which it is not, the rule of lenity would require that we interpret the statute in Cargill's favor. As Justice Holmes framed it years ago, quote, "It is reasonable that a fair warning should be given to the world in language that the common world will understand, of what the law intends to do if a certain line is passed." And that's McBoyle 283 U.S. at 27. We cannot say that the National Firearms Act and Gun Control Act give that fair warning, that possession of a non-mechanical bump stock is a crime. And here's where it ends. The final rule promulgated by the ATF violates the APA, that's the Administrative Procedures Act. We therefore reverse, in all caps, the judgment of the District Court and remand, in all caps, with instructions to enter judgment for Cargill. So certainly this has been determined, the bump stock has been determined not a machine gun for very sound constitutional reasons. This court determined it for Mr. Cargill himself, the plaintiff in Texas. In my opinion, not a lawyer, not telling you guys what to do or not to do. I want to make that very clear. This is excellent news. I just can't give you guys legal advice, right? Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. This was en banc. It cannot be appealed any higher within the circuit. This should be case precedent for the Fifth Circuit, which is Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana. In my opinion, not legal advice, this is not going to be case law or case precedent if you live in Michigan, which is in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals jurisdiction. And I would note the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, I believe it was the 10th, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, had all decided actually opposite of what the Fifth just decided. And when you have a Supreme Court and you want them to hear your case in the United States Supreme Court, there's several ways you can be granted a writ of certiorari, meaning they'll hear the case. They could take an original jurisdiction, or it could be done on the appellate level. There have been attempts to come in and put an injunction or to stop this bump stock rule, this Trump ban by fiat, this executive rule, to be stopped in the Supreme Court that have been turned down before. But now we have what's called a split in the circuits. And not often do they take just any old case in the Supreme Court. However, it drastically increases its probability now that we have a split between several circuits. The Fifth Circuit has clearly split away from some of these other several circuits for several reasons, and they have an opposite conclusion in the bump stock case versus some of the other circuits, in my opinion, that makes it much more likely SCOTUS will hear this. How does it get there? I don't know. Cargill and or gun rights advocate groups may have to bring it there. Or Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, could bring it there. The government usually likes to appeal when they're wrong, except for when they know they got lucky in the past and they don't want to get shot down by the Supreme Court. I don't know if Garland's going to want to take this to the Supreme Court, because the rule was completely unconstitutional, put in by the Trump administration. And I think deep down they would never admit it. They know that. So I'm not so sure Garland's going to appeal this to the Supreme Court, because they might be afraid of the decision that the Supreme Court of the United States would find. And if they agree and concur with the Fifth Circuit, then it would become binding in precedent case law for the whole entire United States. Maybe the Attorney General's office and Garland and the ATF might decide that they'll just leave it where it's been overturned in the Fifth Circuit, but still banned or considered a machine gun in the other 12 circuits. I don't know. What do you guys think? I just know the ATF has been going super, super rogue, and as I've talked about on this channel many times, they're using this bump stock, Chevron deference precedent to try to literally ban like something different every week. This getting overturned in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals is awesome, awesome news. Not just for the people that live in the Fifth Circuit, although it might be particularly better news for you, but for the whole country, because some of the things that they said here that I highlighted, and I'm going to go through more in just a little bit on my stream, really, really puts things into perspective. And what I've read so far of this decision, very, very excellently written case. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and have a good one.